Chapter 1. Beneath the Palm Tree of Peace. The land was heavy with sorrow. For 20 long years the children of Israel lived beneath the shadow of fear. The fields, once rich with harvest, lay trampled by marching feet. The laughter of children had grown quiet. The sound of songs had withered into silence. No one walked the roads without looking over their shoulder, for the land groaned beneath the cruelty of King Jabin of Canaan. His throne rested in the fortress of Hazor, but his terror was felt in every village, every valley, every home. At the head of Jabin's army was a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of the people, Sisera. He rode with 900 chariots of iron, wheels pounding the earth like thunder. His soldiers showed no mercy. They stole from the poor, punished the weak, and crushed hope wherever it flickered. Mothers whispered prayers over their sleeping children, fathers clenched their fists in helplessness, and the elders sat in silence, unable to lift the burden that grew heavier with each passing year. The days were cruel, but the nights were worse. They held a quiet kind of suffering, the kind that settled in the soul. In the darkness, there were no battles, only the weight of waiting for freedom, waiting for change, waiting for God. Yet even in the silence, heaven was listening. The prayers of the oppressed rose like incense, unseen but known. And though the sky seemed still, the Lord was preparing a deliverance unlike any before, one that would begin, not with armies or kings, but with a woman sitting beneath a tree. The rise of a prophetess beneath a tall palm tree, swaying gently in the breeze, sat a woman named Deborah. Her eyes, calm as the morning sky, watched the hills near Ramah and Bethel. She did not wear the robes of royalty, nor did she carry the sword of a soldier. Her throne was the earth, her shelter the tree, her crown the presence of God. The people came to her with their disputes, men and women, rich and poor, young and old. They knelt in the dust, not for power or position, but for peace. And Deborah listened. She listened not only with her ears, but with her heart, a heart that knew the ache of her people and the voice of her God. For she was more than a judge. She was a prophetess, chosen, anointed, and beloved of the Lord. Through her, the voice of heaven spoke in stillness. Her words did not shout, but they stirred hearts. They did not dazzle, but they healed. Like a stream in a dry land, her wisdom brought life to those who had forgotten what hope felt like. And still, she waited. She listened not only to the voices of the people, but to the silence between them. For within that silence, God was preparing something sacred, something bold, something that would turn fear into faith and waiting into war. Deborah did not seek to lead, but God, in his gentle power, was raising her up. And beneath that palm tree, the first quiet steps of deliverance were beginning to move. The spirit of wisdom and fire. Deborah's presence was like a lamp in a darkened house, quiet but radiant. Her days were not filled with shouting or spectacle. She did not call down fire or raise her hands in fury. Instead, she carried within her a flame, steady, unwavering, holy. She saw not just the surface of things, but the deeper truth beneath them. When a mother came weeping over a stolen harvest, Deborah saw more than injustice. She saw the hunger of generations. When a soldier spoke of despair, she saw not just weariness, but a soul longing to remember courage. The people did not come to her for answers alone. They came for presence, for the nearness of someone who walked with God. Her voice reminded them of what they had forgotten, that Yahweh was still near, still watching, still waiting to move. Deborah was not a woman of ambition, but of obedience, and it was this obedience that made her strong. In the quiet of her prayers, she felt it growing, the stirring of something greater. Like the wind before the rain, the Spirit of God moved over her, not in frenzy, but in purpose. Her heart burned with a righteous ache, not of anger, but of compassion. She saw the faces of her people in her dreams. She heard their cries in the silence, and in her spirit the Lord whispered, "The time is near." The weight of that call was not heavy, but holy. She knew it was not hers to carry alone, but hers to begin. Like the spark before the fire, her obedience would become the flame that called others to rise, a whisper from heaven. It was early, before the sun had crested the hills. The air was cool, and the world was still wrapped in the hush of dawn. Birds had not yet sung, and the earth waited in quiet. Deborah knelt beneath the palm tree, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes closed in stillness. Her heart, as always, was listening, and then it came, not as a storm, not as thunder, but as a whisper. A voice, clear and unmistakable, settled over her like morning light. It did not tremble the earth, but it shook her soul. "Call Barak, son of Abinoam," it said. "Tell him to take 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them to Mount Tabor. There I will draw out Sisera with his chariots and his army, and I will give him into your hands." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of deliverance. Deborah opened her eyes, the morning breeze brushing her face. She did not tremble. She did not run. She rose. There was no hesitation in her steps, no doubt in her spirit. She did not ask for signs. She did not wait for approval. When God whispered, she moved. She called for Barak just as the Lord commanded, a warrior brave and seasoned, though wearied by years of waiting. He came to her with eyes full of questions, and she met them with eyes full of fire. "The Lord God of Israel commands you," she said. "Go." And though Barak would ask her to come with him, and she would, the path had already begun. For it was not the strength of men or the iron of chariots that would bring victory. It was the whisper of God, obeyed by a woman beneath a tree. Chapter 2. A Summons to Barak. The hills of Kadesh were quiet that morning, their slopes still brushed with the silver mist of dawn. Dew clung gently to the fig leaves, and the dry earth waited for the warmth of sun to soften its cracks. Yet, under that still sky, there stirred the quiet ache of a man caught between fear and calling. Barak, son of Abinoam, stood near the edge of the village, where the road curled into the wilderness beyond. He was no stranger to battle. His arms had known the weight of the sword, his ears the cry of war. He had walked among broken walls and counted the names of the fallen. But now it was not the clamor of conflict that troubled his heart. It was the summons from Deborah. A messenger had come at first light, dusty and breathless, bearing a message from the prophetess of Israel, a simple message, yet heavy with purpose. "Come to me, son of Abinoam." It was not a command of men, but a call of God, and it pressed against the edges of Barak's soul. He had heard of Deborah, how she sat beneath the palm tree between Ramah and Bethel, where the people gathered to seek wisdom. He had heard how her words calmed disputes and carried the quiet weight of heaven. But he had not expected her voice to call his name. Now, as the morning rose and the shadows shrank, behind him Barak felt the tremble of questions he could not voice. Why him? Why now? He knew the strength of Sisera's army. He had seen the iron wheels of the chariots and the gleam of cruel blades. And he had also seen the weariness of his own people, tired, scattered, unarmed. A call to battle was not new. But this was something deeper. This was a call to trust not in sword, but in the word of the Lord. Barak turned his face to the breeze, letting it touch his brow like a whisper. There was fear in his heart, yes. But there was also the faint stir of something more, a beginning. And so, with the sound of birdsong rising in the hills behind him, Barak prepared to walk the road to Deborah's tree. God's strategy, not man's. The sun was higher now, warming the path as it wound through the trees. Deborah sat as she always did, beneath the broad canopy of her palm, her eyes lifted toward the hills. She had waited in stillness, and now her waiting ended. She saw Barak approaching before he spoke, his steps steady, but his heart heavy. She welcomed him not with grandness, but with peace. Her voice, when it came, was calm and sure, as if it had already known the journey of his soul. "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you," she said. "Go. Take with you 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor." Barak listened, his brow furrowed with questions, yet unspoken. Deborah's eyes remained on him, unflinching. "The Lord will lead Sisera to the river Kishon," she continued. "His chariots, his army, they will be there. And he will give them into your hands." Not a word of uncertainty passed her lips. There was no hesitation in her tone, for this was not Deborah's plan. It was the Lord's, the same Lord who had heard the cries of his people, the same Lord who had called to Moses from the bush and led Joshua through Jordan's flood. This was his battle. Barak looked down, his thoughts swirling like dust in the wind. 10,000 men from these broken tribes, could they even lift their heads, let alone their swords? And yet Deborah's words had a stillness about them, like the hush before a holy storm, a strategy not of might, but of obedience. 10,000 from among the weary, a mountain, a river, and a promise. Barak felt the weight of his own limitations. He saw in his mind the iron chariots, Sisera's army fanned out across the plain. He did not doubt God's power, but he did doubt his own part in it. Still, the plan was not his to shape. It was only his to walk, if you will go with me. Barak raised his eyes to Deborah, and his voice broke the silence, not with defiance, but with longing. "If you will go with me, I will go," he said. "But if you will not go with me, I will not go." There was no pride in his words, only need. He did not ask Deborah to lead the charge or raise a banner. He asked her to go with him, to carry the presence of God beside him on the path of fear. In this, Barak's request was not a weakness, but a window into his heart. He sought not Deborah's strength, but the nearness of the one who spoke through her. He did not need another sword. He needed assurance that God would not be distant when the chariots rolled. Deborah did not scold, she did not shame, she answered with grace, her voice steady as ever. "I will surely go with you," she said. "But know this, the road you take will not lead to your glory. The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." Her words were not a rebuke, but a revelation. Even now, God was shaping a deliverance beyond human understanding, a victory that would not be written with the names of warriors alone, but with the quiet courage of women, those who stood in obedience when others waited in fear. Barak nodded slowly, not with pride, but with resolve. The path was no longer about his strength, it was about faith. And Deborah's presence, her nearness, would be the ember he needed to carry the flame forward. Together they stood, the prophetess and the warrior, the word and the sword, and the God who held them both. The march begins. Words spread like wind through the land, a sound not of noise but of movement. A stirring among the tents, a whisper between neighbors. Deborah had spoken, Barak had answered, and the time to rise had come. Men from Naphtali and Zebulun, farmers, shepherds, fathers began to gather. Their hands bore the calluses of labor, not of war, but their hearts, long dormant beneath fear, began to stir with courage. They had no iron, but they had hope. Deborah moved among them not as a general, but as a mother of Israel. Her presence was a quiet fire. Her words, though few, kindled peace. And Barak, once reluctant, now resolved, stood at her side, gathering strength not from pride, but from purpose. Mount Tabor rose in the distance, its slopes green with promise. The men climbed it not with shouts, but with steady steps, 10,000 strong, yet not by might. They moved with the weight of something holy behind them, and in the distance the shadow of Sisera stirred. His scouts had seen the movement. His horses pawed the earth. His chariots gleamed in the sun, cruel and sure. But he did not see the palm tree. He did not hear the whisper of the Lord. He saw only men. He did not see the hand of God moving through a woman's call and a warrior's obedience. As the last light of day faded behind the hills, Israel's silent army stood ready. The wind moved through the trees, the stars appeared one by one, and heaven held its breath. Chapter 3. Jael's Quiet Tent. The hills breathed in silence, not the silence of dread, but the stillness of simple life. Nestled among the trees and set apart from the noise of kings and war horses, the camp of the Kenites lay quiet beneath the wide sky. There, where the wind moved gently through tamarisk trees and the birds flew low over sunlit rocks, peace had found a resting place. The Kenites were not warriors, they were wanderers, craftsmen, tent makers, and metal workers. Though they were distant relatives of Moses by marriage, they had long lived apart from Israel's battles. Their loyalties were not written in iron, but lived quietly in tents and trails. They followed peace when peace could be found. Among them was a woman named Jael. The wife of Heber, she was neither ruler nor priestess, yet her presence carried a quiet strength. Her hands moved with purpose, stitching canvas, grinding grain, tying cords that held the fabric of life together. Her days passed in the rhythm of the ordinary, cooking, mending, tending to fire and family. But heaven was watching. Jael did not know that the road of war would soon touch her doorstep. She had not seen the face of Sisera, nor walked beneath Deborah's palm tree. She did not know of Barak's army or the chariots of Hazor that waited on the plain. Yet, in the tapestry of God's plan, a thread had been tied to her name. Though she lived in the quiet of the hills, Jael was not forgotten. God's eye was on her, not for what she had done, but for what she would do. In her stillness, a place was being prepared. In her home, a story would unfold that only heaven could have written. And so she moved, unaware of what lay ahead, but faithful in all that lay before her. And the hills held their breath, a woman of watchful spirit. Jael rose early, as she always did. The morning sky was pale and quiet, and the first light touched the top of the distant hills with gold. She stepped outside her tent, her bare feet pressing gently against the earth, and looked to the east. There was no trumpet sound in the wind, no horse's hoof broke the soil, but Jael felt it, a shifting in the spirit, a tremble beneath the stillness. Her hands poured water for morning bread, yet her eyes lingered on the road. Something unseen stirred, like the faint scent of rain before the clouds gather. She was not afraid. Jael was not a woman who chased danger, but neither did she flee from it. Her spirit was woven from threads of peace and courage, quiet, steady, unshaken. She had lived long among the wandering tribes and knew how to read the signs of change. Birds flew differently when something troubled the land. The dogs barked more quickly. The air felt heavier. Heber, her husband, had gone out early to tend to trade along a distant path. Alone now, Jael walked between the tents with a calm that hid her watchfulness. She collected firewood, checked the stitching along the tent's edge, and straightened the worn mats where the children had once lain. There was no battle near her, not yet, but she felt its breath on the wind. Jael did not name it aloud, but she prayed quietly in her heart. She asked not for answers, but for readiness. For if something was coming, she wanted to meet it with her eyes open. The unseen threads of providence. Long before battles are fought with swords, they are prepared in stillness. And long before great names are spoken, quiet hands are readied for holy work. Even as Barak's army gathered on Mount Tabor and Sisera's chariots rolled toward the river, heaven was setting a scene that no man could have written. It did not begin in a palace, nor in the camp of warriors. It began in a tent, ordinary and worn, tended by a woman whose name had not yet been called. The fabric of Jael's tent fluttered gently in the breeze. She swept the dust from its entrance. She folded the blankets and stirred the embers of the hearth. She filled the clay jug with water and trimmed the oil wick that lit the evening shadows. Each act was simple, each task small, yet God wove through them with invisible fingers. A hammer leaned quietly beside the tent post. Tent pegs lay in a wooden bowl by the door. They were tools of shelter, not of war. But the Lord, in his deep wisdom, knew what they would become. Jael did not yet see it. Her thoughts were still wrapped in daily things. But heaven had already chosen her. Long before she understood her role, God had prepared her place. Not with fanfare or prophecy, but with the sacredness of being present, faithful in stillness, alert in spirit. In the courts of men, it was a time of battle. But in Jael's camp, it was a time of readiness. The quiet tools of her life, the things she touched each day, would soon become instruments of divine justice. And her tent, set far from the noise of cities, would become the setting of a prophecy fulfilled. Heaven waits in stillness. Night descended slowly, soft as a shawl drawn over the shoulders of the earth. The stars opened their eyes one by one, and the moon rose like a lamp hung in the heavens. Inside her tent, Jael moved quietly. She lit the oil lamp and sat beside the folded blankets. The embers in the hearth glowed low, giving off a gentle warmth. She poured water into a small clay bowl and soaked a cloth to clean her hands. Outside, the wind had stilled. Even the animals lay down in silence. It was a holy kind of quiet, not empty, but full. As if the breath of God lingered in the air, waiting for the next line in his unfolding story. Jael looked out through the folds of the canvas. The road beyond her camp was hidden in shadows. There was no movement, no sound of riders, but she felt it, awaiting. In her heart there was no fear, only a sense of being watched, not by danger, but by destiny. She was not a prophetess. She had no vision or voice from heaven, but her soul listened. She had been listening all day. Stillness can be sacred. And in Jael's tent, stillness had taken root. The night wore on. She added a few sticks to the fire. She folded the last blanket and laid it near the edge of the tent. Her hands rested for a moment in her lap, the flickering light playing across her face. Far off, unseen by her eyes, Sisera's army had been broken. The river Kishon had swept away his chariots. The soldiers scattered, and Sisera, the feared commander, now ran alone, seeking refuge. But Jael did not know this yet. She only knew that the night felt different, holy, and that someone was coming. So she waited, not with fear, but with readiness. And all of heaven waited with her. Chapter 4. The Storm over Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor stood like a sentinel above the plains, its round shoulders rising softly from the earth. From afar, it looked peaceful, a place untouched by the troubles that swept across Israel. But today, the mountain had been chosen for something sacred. Barak, son of Abinoam, moved quietly among the people. 10,000 men followed him, not soldiers seasoned in war, but men of faith who had answered a call. Some were shepherds, others farmers. They had come from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun, walking dusty roads with hearts full of trembling hope. Each one climbed the slope with the weight of his own fears, and with the whisper of God in his soul. The air grew still as they ascended. The stones beneath their feet felt ancient, and the trees swayed gently as though bowing in reverence to something unseen. The climb was not hurried. It was deliberate, prayerful. Every step was more than a movement of the body. It was an offering of trust. Deborah walked among them, steady and quiet. Her presence did not shout, but it settled over the people like a mantle of peace. She spoke softly, but her words held the weight of heaven. "The Lord has gone before you," she said to them. "This mountain is not a place of fear, but of preparation." At the summit, they rested. The wind moved around them, cool and clean, and the sky above seemed to stretch forever. There were no chariots here, no shouting, just the stillness of waiting and the gentle stirring of God's nearness. The mountain had become more than a gathering place. It had become a sanctuary, a holy place where doubt melted beneath the sun and faith was quietly forged. The chariots of iron draw. Near far below, the plains of Jezreel stretched wide, a place of open fields and old scars. It was here that Sisera heard the news. Word had reached him swiftly. Israel was rising. Deborah the prophetess had spoken. Barak the warrior had gathered an army, and they were waiting on Mount Tabor. Sisera did not wait. He summoned his strength with the urgency of thunder. 900 iron chariots were drawn together, wheels polished, horses yoked, soldiers clad in armor. Their banners flapped in the wind. The valley filled with the sharp clang of steel and the low rumble of war drums. The people of Canaan were confident. They had chariots of iron, symbols of dominance, tools of terror. They had crushed uprisings before. To them, this battle was a formality. Sisera looked to the mountain, his eyes sharp. He saw no walls, no fortresses, only men and women standing beneath open sky. And he smiled. The earth trembled under the approach of his army. Dust rose in waves. Behind the iron wheels, horses neighed and pawed at the ground, and soldiers shouted with voices meant to stir fear. The valley of Kishon, once quiet, now echoed with the strength of men. But heaven did not tremble. The Lord was not moved by numbers, nor was he swayed by iron. The noise of men does not silence the voice of God. The strength of the world has no power over the plan of heaven. On the mountain, Deborah stood still, her eyes fixed on the valley. The enemy had come. The hour had arrived, but her heart was not shaken. For the Lord, who sees from everlasting to everlasting, had already prepared the victory. Deborah's call to battle. The wind shifted, it moved down from the mountain, carrying with it the scent of rain and the breath of something unseen. Deborah's eyes did not leave the valley below. Around her the men stood in silence, watching the storm of iron that filled the plains. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, not loud, but clear, as though it rose from something deeper than sound. It was the voice of obedience, of unshaken faith. "Up," she said, turning to Barak. "This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" Barak did not speak. He looked at her, then looked to the sky. The clouds were gathering. He took a breath and stepped forward. His feet, firm on the mountain rock, began the descent. Behind him, 10,000 followed, not with shouts of bravado, but with the solemn strength of those who trust in God. The sound of their steps grew, rising like a river released from stone. From the heights of Tabor they came, not with chariots, but with courage, not with might, but with obedience. The mountain echoed softly with the rustle of tunics, the brushing of sandals, the rising heartbeat of a faithful people. Below, Sisera waited. He saw the army descending. He heard no trumpet. He saw no banners. And yet something in the air shifted, a weight, invisible yet heavy. The wind grew cooler, the sky dimmed, the first clap of thunder rolled across the valley, long and deep. It was not the cry of men. It was the voice of heaven moving, the rain sent by God. And then it came, the rain. Not a gentle drizzle, but a sudden, sacred storm. Clouds broke open and poured like rivers from the sky. The wind howled across the plains, sweeping the dust into chaos. Thunder boomed, shaking the very ground. Lightning tore through the heavens. The soldiers of Sisera faltered. The chariots, so proud in their strength, struggled. Wheels sank into the mud. Horses slipped and reared. Commands were drowned out by the roar of water and wind. Iron turned to burden. Strategy became confusion. It was not the sword that scattered them. It was the rain, sent not by nature but by God. The river Kishon, usually calm and winding, swelled with holy force. It overflowed its banks, surging through the valley like the judgment of the Lord. Men screamed, not from wounds, but from fear. The chariots, once swift and mighty, now stuck fast in the mire. Barak and his men descended upon them, not as conquerors, but as vessels of God's will. They moved with purpose, but they knew. The victory was not theirs. It belonged to the one who commands the wind, to the one who rides upon the storm, to the one who listens to the cries of his people and answers with deliverance. Sisera fled. His pride, once clothed in steel, now ran on foot, soaked and broken. He abandoned his chariot and vanished into the shadows, seeking refuge. But even in his flight, the hand of the Lord followed. As the storm quieted and the last of the thunder rolled across the sky, Barak stood among his people, drenched in rain. And the battle was over, not by might, not by power, but by the Spirit of the Lord. Chapter 5. The Fall of Sisera. The storm had not ceased, but Sisera could no longer stay. Rain fell in sheets, washing the blood of the battlefield into the swollen river below. The mighty chariots, so feared for their iron strength, now lay mired and broken in the mud. Their wheels, once proud and swift, spun uselessly in the clay. Soldiers stumbled in retreat, cries drowned by thunder, strategy undone by heaven's hand. Sisera stood alone among the ruin, his armor soaked and heavy, his breath sharp with disbelief. His army, the 900 chariots of Canaan, had fallen into chaos, and he, the commander, who once held Israel in fear, could feel the earth shift beneath him. This was no ordinary defeat. This was something more, something sacred. The Lord had moved, not with armies, but with rain, and now the mighty general fled. He left behind the metal beasts, the broken soldiers, the war cries swallowed by wind. He turned from the valley and slipped into the wild, no longer a leader, no longer a warrior, but a man running from the will of God. His footsteps were clumsy in the mud. His garments clung to him like chains, but still he ran deeper into the shadows of the forest, away from the flood he could not stop. No man escapes the hand of heaven, and Sisera, though he ran with all the strength of his limbs, could not outrun what God had already written. A flight through the forests, the trees closed around him like gates of silence. Sisera moved through the forest, stumbling over roots slick with rain. The path was no path at all, only patches of soil between ancient trees where moss grew thick and branches reached low. The sounds of war were behind him now, muted by distance and storm. Only his breath remained. Ragged, hurried, desperate, his armor pulled at his shoulders. The sword at his side was useless now, more burden than weapon. Every step forward felt heavier than the last. His pride had fallen somewhere in the mud behind him, and all that remained was the will to survive. He did not know where he was going, only that he could not stop. The forest offered no comfort. It whispered with voices older than war, winds that had watched empires rise and fall. Birds watched him from high branches, thorns scratched his legs, his feet bled, but still he moved. Not toward a plan, but toward a fate unseen. There is a silence in the wilderness that humbles even the strongest. Here, there were no soldiers to command, no titles to wear, only a man alone and the God who watched every trembling step. Sisera thought he had escaped, but each mile led him closer to something greater than judgment, a divine appointment, one not written in iron, but in the quiet will of God. And just beyond the next bend, past the olive trees and low hills, a tent stood waiting. Its door was open, and inside, a woman prepared for the moment heaven had chosen for her. Jael welcomes. The enemy. The storm had softened now, falling as a steady hush over the land. In the shelter of the trees, Jael stood outside her tent, gathering the last of the blankets she had hung to dry. The earth smelled of rain and renewal. The silence was deep yet alert, as if it too was listening. A movement. A figure emerged through the trees, tall, soaked, breathless. Jael's eyes narrowed with caution, but she did not step back. She recognized the uniform. The face, though muddied, bore the trace of command. This was Sisera, and he was not charging with an army. He was alone. Sisera called out, his voice low with exhaustion. "Please, hide me! Give me water! They are pursuing me!" Jael stepped forward calmly, her hands still wrapped in cloth. She offered no alarm, no visible fear. Only welcome. "Come in, my lord," she said gently. "Do not be afraid." She opened the flap of her tent and led him inside. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She did not give him water, but milk, cool and comforting. She poured it into a skin, handed it to him, and draped a blanket over his shoulders. "You have nothing to fear," she said softly, her voice like the hush of night. Sisera, weary beyond words, sank into the ground and closed his eyes. "Stand at the door," he murmured. "If anyone comes, tell them I am not here." Jael nodded, but her thoughts were not on his words. She listened, not to the voice of a man, but to the voice of God. The one who had stirred Deborah, who had commanded Barak, who had sent the rain, now whispered to her. Not in thunder, but in stillness. And Jael, wife of Heber, daughter of peace, stood in quiet obedience. For though she bore no sword, heaven had placed in her hands a purpose. The tent peg and the promise. The tent was silent, the storm had passed, and inside Sisera slept. His breath was slow, deep, untroubled. He had found what he thought was safety, but the peace he felt was not his own. It had been offered, but not for his comfort, for judgment. Jael moved without haste. Her hands, steady from years of setting tents, knew the weight of the hammer, the shape of the peg. These were not weapons. They were tools of her daily life. But now they became something more, instruments in the hand of God. She knelt quietly beside him, her steps hushed by earth and cloth. Her eyes did not tremble, her spirit did not waver. She was not moved by fear, she was moved by faith. With one strike, sure, unshaken, the enemy of Israel fell, not by sword, not by fire, but by the courage of a woman whose heart had heard the Lord. Outside, the world remained quiet. No trumpet sounded, no crowd gathered, only the wind moved softly through the trees, bearing witness to what heaven already knew. The hand of God had moved, and Israel's greatest oppressor, the one who had brought fear to every village, who had ruled with cruelty and confidence, was no more. Jael stood alone, the blanket still folded at her side. There were no cheers, only the stillness of completion, the sacred silence that comes when a promise is fulfilled. She had not gone to battle. She had not ridden with soldiers, but she had walked in obedience, and in that obedience the victory was sealed. Chapter 6. Deborah's Song of Triumph. Morning rose gently over the land, not with thunder or wind, but with golden light stretching softly across the hills of Israel. The battle was over. The cries had ceased. The swords had been lowered. And in the hush of dawn, something far deeper than silence filled the air. It was the presence of peace and the echo of divine deliverance. Deborah stood still, her eyes lifted toward the heavens. Her hands were not raised in command, but in praise. The Lord had done what only He could do. And now the prophetess opened her mouth, and a song was born, not rehearsed, not composed, but breathed through the Spirit. A melody of memory, a proclamation of truth. Praise the Lord for the avenging of Israel, she sang, when the people willingly offered themselves. Her voice moved like wind through cedar trees, steady, sacred, soaked in reverence. She sang of days long, gone and victories freshly won. She sang of mountains trembling and rivers sweeping down in holy fury. She sang of a God who does not slumber, who rides upon the storm, who answers with rain and fire. The earth shook, she sang. The heavens dropped. The clouds poured water. The mountains melted before the Lord. And then, her voice, lifted higher, reaching beyond what eyes could see. From the heavens the stars fought, she declared. From their courses they fought against Sisera. It was not only men who had warred that day. The elements, the sky, the very stars themselves had moved in divine harmony with the will of God. Deborah's song gave voice to the mystery that even the heavens joined Israel in her deliverance. For when God fights, nothing remains still. This was no ordinary song. It was remembrance, it was revelation, and it was praise, pure, holy, and true. Blessed among women. As her song continued, Deborah's voice slowed, not with sorrow, but with reverence. A single name emerged from the melody. a name not of kings or captains, a name from a quiet tent in the hills. Blessed above women shall Jael be, she sang, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Blessed shall she be among women in tents. There was no fanfare in Jael's hand, no army behind her. She had not ridden into battle, nor stood before thousands, but heaven had seen her, and through Deborah's lips her faith was honored. She brought no sword, she wielded no spear. Yet she acted with courage as fierce as flame and obedience as soft as wool. She listened when God whispered. She moved when the time came, and by her hand the enemy fell. Not by might, but by quiet faithfulness. She brought him milk, Deborah sang. In a lordly bowl she offered cream. She stretched forth her hand to the tent peg, her right hand to the workman's hammer. The words were tender, but weighty. They told of hands that served, hands that nurtured, and in one holy moment, hands that became vessels of God's justice. Deborah did not exalt violence. She exalted faith. Jael's strength was not in force, but in surrender, not in power, but in purpose. And so her name was woven into the sacred melody, not lost to time, but lifted above it. She who dwelt in tents was crowned with words that only a prophetess could sing. Curse of Meroz, blessing of the faithful, but not all names were lifted. Deborah's song, though sweet, held a note of sorrow. For when heaven called and the earth trembled, some had turned away. Some towns, some tribes had chosen silence when the voice of God rang through the land. Curse ye Meroz, Deborah sang gently, because they came not to the help of the Lord. To the help of the Lord against the mighty. There was no hatred in her voice, only grief. It was not sin that was remembered here, but stillness. Not the stillness of trust, but the stillness of neglect. When others rose, Meroz stood, unmoved. When the trumpet sounded, they remained behind closed doors. But the faithful, the ones who answered, were wrapped in honor. Deborah sang of Ephraim, who came forth with courage, of Zebulun and Naphtali, who offered their lives on the battlefield, of Issachar, who stood beside her, loyal and sure. These were not just tribes. They were threads in God's tapestry, woven into a story of victory born from obedience. She sang of those who rode upon white donkeys and sat in judgment, who heard the cry of the people and did not delay. She sang of villagers who once hid in fear, but now stood in song. For faith is not measured by strength, but by response, and the song remembered both, those who came and those who did not to shame, but to teach. For every generation would hear this song. Every heart would be invited to ask, when God calls, will I come? A lullaby for a nation at rest. The song slowed now. Its edges softened. Like the hush after a prayer, it descended into quiet peace. Deborah's voice no longer rose in declaration. It fell into stillness like the settling of dust after rain. She sang of Sisera's mother, waiting at her window wondering why her son delayed. She pictured the ladies of his court offering answers, speaking of plunder and victory, but none would come. Only silence. It was not cruelty, but contrast. As one mother waited in vain, others in Israel embraced their sons with tears of joy. As one tent lay empty in sorrow, the the land of God's people filled with laughter and rest. "So let all your enemies perish, O Lord," Deborah whispered into her song. "But let those who love you be as the sun when it rises in strength." The final line came not with fanfare, but with blessing. And the land had rest for 40 years. That was the end, not of the melody, but of the war. For when the Lord delivers, he does not only crush the enemy, he restores the soul. He does not only silence the sword, he sings a lullaby of peace over his people. 40 years, a full generation, a season of stillness sown by the obedience of a prophetess, the courage of a warrior, the hands of a quiet woman, and the mercy of God. Deborah's song faded into the wind, but its words did not die. They lingered in the hearts of those who heard, in the hills where battles had been fought, and in the soul of a nation now at rest beneath the wings of God. Chapter 7. The Years of Peace. The sword was silent now. Across the hills of Israel there were no marching feet. The roads once worn by soldiers now carried baskets of grain and the laughter of children. Trees that once stood beside battlefields now shaded shepherds tending their flocks. The cries of fear that once rose like smoke from the valleys had faded into lullabies and prayer. The land, once trembling under iron and war, had found breath again. It began like a whisper, a stillness that crept into the soil and settled into the soul. The people, bruised and wearied from long years of oppression, began to remember what it meant to be free. Slowly, as seasons passed and skies brightened, they remembered how to live. The fields were tilled again. Wheat bowed softly in the wind, golden and full. The vineyards bloomed, and the olives ripened in peace. Markets filled with color. Homes echoed with the sound of new life. Mothers sang over their little ones. Fathers blessed their harvests under open skies, and in their hearts the people held one name close, Deborah. It was under her hand, and through God's great mercy, that this peace had come. She had not only led them to battle, she had led them to rest. And now, for 40 years, the land would breathe, not in the silence of defeat, but in the hush of contentment, not in the stillness of fear, but in the gentleness of peace. Wisdom beneath the palm tree. Beneath the tall branches of a lone palm, Deborah sat once more. It was the same place, and between Ramah and Bethel, where years before she had listened to the cries of the people. The same quiet earth, the same whispering leaves, the same gaze lifted toward heaven. But now, the voices that came to her were different. They no longer pleaded for rescue. They came seeking wisdom. Men approached her with questions about land and livestock. Women came with concerns about marriage and family. Elders sought counsel, young ones sought blessing. And through it all, Deborah listened, not only to words, but to hearts. Her eyes were kind, her voice soft. Yet there was no mistaking her strength. She did not rule with force or fear. She ruled with peace. The people called her a judge, but she was more than that. She was a mother to Israel, not by birth, but by spirit. Her wisdom had no edge, but it carried weight. When she spoke, the people leaned in. And when she was silent, they waited. She had not sought power. She had simply said yes to God. And in doing so, she had become a vessel for his voice. Each day beneath the palm, Deborah welcomed the people, not to be praised, but to serve. She offered clarity, she offered comfort, and above all, she reminded them of the one who truly led them. It was not her palm that protected them, it was the presence of the Lord, the legacy of leadership. The men who once stood trembling beneath Mount Tabor now walked with heads held high, not with pride, but with understanding. They had learned from the prophetess, learned that strength was not in numbers, nor in swords, but in surrender. Deborah had taught them that the truest victory begins in the soul, when fear bows to faith, and when silence gives way to obedience. She had shown them that leadership was not loud, that courage could wear the face of a woman and the tone of a whisper. She had not claimed greatness, and in doing so had become great. Barak, once hesitant, now walked in confidence. His days were marked not by battle, but by remembrance. He told his sons of the storm, the mountain, and the woman whose words had steadied him. He no longer needed a sword to prove his worth. Deborah had shown him a better way. Others, too, took notice. Tribal elders began to lead, not with fear, but with patience. Disputes were handled with listening before judgment. Families were guided with gentleness, not force. The old ways of rule, rooted in might and urgency, began to fade, and in their place a quiet kind of strength took root. One born not of power, but of presence. Deborah's leadership was not a monument, it was a seed, and it was growing. A generation grows in light years past, and new voices filled the land. Children who had never seen war now learned of it around the fire. They sat wide-eyed as stories were told, of iron chariots, of a swollen river, of a whisper from God beneath a palm tree. They heard not only of battle, but of bravery, not only of fear, but of faith. And always, always, the name of Deborah was spoken with reverence. She listened to God, the elders would say. She did not rush, she did not shout, she waited, and when the Lord spoke, she obeyed. The children grew beneath skies unmarked by smoke. Their feet knew paths lined with flowers instead of footprints of soldiers. They memorized songs, not strategies. Their first memories were not of hiding, but of harvest. Their games were not shaped by fear, but by joy, and yet within them a quiet courage formed, because the stories shaped them. They heard how one woman's yes to God had changed everything, how one tent had become the setting for deliverance, how one storm had become the song of a nation, and how peace, long, deep, and holy, had come through the obedience of those who listened. Deborah was not just remembered, she was imitated. And though her voice would one day fall silent, her legacy would live on, not in books or buildings, but in hearts. Hearts that believed God still speaks. Hearts that knew His peace could come again. Chapter 8. A Prophetess Among Men. There was no crown resting on her head. No golden thread embroidered her robe. She bore no title of priest, nor was she counted among the kings. Yet when Deborah spoke, the earth seemed to quiet, and the people turned their hearts to listen. Her authority was not written on scrolls or carved into stone. It was not inherited from bloodlines or appointed by councils. It was breathed upon her, not by man, but by the Spirit of God. In a world where men led armies and built altars, Deborah stood with neither sword nor censer. She carried no weapon, and yet her words cut through silence. She offered no sacrifice of beasts, and yet her prayers rose like incense. Her strength was not worn on her sleeve. It lived within her, quiet, unwavering, holy. She did not shout to be heard. She did not fight for position. Her life was shaped not by ambition, but by obedience. She listened, and because she listened, God spoke. The palm tree beneath which she sat became her throne. The dust upon which people knelt became her court. And though no crown adorned her brow, the authority of heaven rested upon her shoulders like sunlight at dawn. Deborah's calling was not framed by title. It was shaped by trust. She stood not to claim her place, but to fulfill the one God had given her. And in that obedience, she became more than a prophetess. She became a voice of deliverance, a channel of peace, a light in Israel's long night. She did not need the recognition of men. She had the anointing of God, shepherding a nation's heart. Deborah did not carry a staff, but she led like a shepherd. She did not raise a banner, but her presence brought direction. Her footsteps were not followed by armies, but her prayers prepared their path. Day after day, she returned to the place between Ramah and Bethel. Beneath her palm, the wind moved through the branches like whispered prayers, and the people came, not out of duty, but out of need. They came with their questions, their burdens, their wounds, and Deborah received them with eyes that saw deeper than flesh and words that settled deeper than bone. She did not answer too quickly. She listened, and when she spoke, the words were few, but they stayed. She was not appointed to reign, but she ruled with wisdom. Her decisions were not written in law, but in love. Her voice did not command, yet it carried weight. There was no need to shout when heaven was behind her whisper. Israel had known strong men, men with spears and soldiers, but Deborah's strength came differently. It came like oil poured gently, not to burn, but to heal. It came like water flowing through dry ground, not to drown, but to grow. She was not only a leader of people, she was a steward of their hearts. When the land groaned beneath oppression, she taught them to hope. When fear crept in like night, she reminded them of the dawn. When the people wavered, she stood firm, not to be seen, but so others could stand with her. She led without conquest. She guided without force, and in her softness, Israel found its strength again. The counsel of heaven. The people brought their lives to her, their questions, their quarrels, their confessions. Not all came with great needs. Some sought clarity in small things, a boundary, a trade, a lost lamb. Others brought heartbreak, a child who had gone astray, a husband lost in the field, a promise broken and bruised. And some brought silence, not knowing what they needed, only that they needed something. And so they came. They waited beneath the tree, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes often cast down. And Deborah, seated in stillness, welcomed them one by one. She did not judge with haste. She did not answer without prayer. She would listen. She would close her eyes, and sometimes she would not speak at all. Not yet. because her counsel did not come from her mind alone. It came from time with the Lord, from mornings spent in quiet, from nights beneath the stars, from moments when the Spirit stirred within her like wind across water. When she spoke, it was not to impress, it was to reveal, not her own wisdom, but God's. There were times her answers surprised even those who asked, times when her insight pierced deeper than expected, times when her voice held a gentleness that broke down the hardest pride, and a firmness that lifted the most fragile soul. And through this, the people learned. They learned that God was near. They learned that He still spoke, and they learned to trust, not just Deborah, but the one who whispered through her heart. In her voice, they began to hear the echo of heaven when a woman hears. The Lord Deborah's life was not loud. It did not blaze across the sky like lightning. It did not shake the earth with thunder. It unfolded like a sunrise, yes, slow, sacred, sure. She did not speak to prove. She spoke to serve. She did not act to be known. She acted to be faithful. And in her faithfulness, she became a sermon, not one written in ink, but lived in quiet days and holy decisions. Her life taught without preaching. Her presence taught without pointing. Her obedience became a lantern, lighting the way for those unsure of where to step. She taught that leadership was not about rising above, but walking alongside. She taught that power did not come from position, but from posture, the posture of a heart bowed before the Lord. She taught that God does not look for titles. He looks for trust. She was a woman in a world of men, yet she never tried to be more than that. She never asked to be heard. She simply heard the Lord, and that hearing made all the difference. Through her, Israel saw what it meant to walk with God. Through her, daughters learned that their voice mattered. Through her, sons learned to follow wisdom wrapped in gentleness. Through her, a nation remembered that God chooses as He pleases, not by strength, not by appearance, but by surrender. Deborah's name would not fade. It would become a song, a legacy, not because she fought with swords, but because she listened and said yes. Chapter 9, The Shadow Returns. There is a stillness that follows peace, a quietness that grows not from rest, but from forgetting. Years passed since the storm had broken Sisera's chariots, since Jael had closed her tent in silence, since Deborah's song had echoed across the hills of Israel and settled like a lullaby over a weary land. The story had been told and retold by firelight on dusty porches in the hush of evening prayers. Children knew the names. Elders remembered the march down Mount Tabor. The people of Israel had lived under the soft canopy of peace for many years. But memory, even sacred memory, can fade. And so it began. Slowly, almost gently, not with rebellion, but with distraction. Not with defiance, but with distance. The urgency that once filled every prayer became polite ritual. The songs of deliverance were still sung, but with quieter voices. Some no longer remembered what it felt like to be afraid. Others had never known anything but peace. And the longer the calm continued, the more the people forgot the cost it carried. They forgot the rain that fell by the hand of God. They forgot the palm tree and the woman who waited beneath it. They forgot that peace was not born from silence. It was born from surrender. And in that forgetting, a shadow began to rise. Not loud, not fast, but sure, for when memory fades, so does reverence. And when reverence grows dim, the heart forgets how to tremble before the Lord. Complacency in the camp. The tents were still pitched, the flocks still grazed, the oil still burned in the lamps. But something had shifted, comfort had come, not the kind that heals, but the kind that lulls. It settled over the camp like a warm blanket at dusk, soothing the soul to sleep. And in that sleep, the people began to look inward. Their prayers became shorter, their gatherings fewer. The covenant, once held close, was now assumed, taken for granted. And when the awe of God became ordinary, other things began to take his place. Small shrines appeared at the edges of the settlements. Stones stacked not for remembrance, but for worship. Carved images shaped not by the command of God, but by the imagination of men. Offerings laid before figures who had eyes that could not see and hands that could not save. The sacred flame that had once burned in the heart of Israel, the fire that called them to holiness, to obedience, to trust, now flickered, faint and fragile. Deborah saw it. She saw the drift in the people's eyes, the way they no longer came to the palm tree with urgency. The way the questions had changed, not what is God saying, but what is best for me. She saw how the children played near the altars of Baal, not knowing the difference, and her heart ached, not with anger, but with holy sorrow. She had walked this land when it groaned under oppression. She had seen the face of a nation bowed low in fear, and she had seen God lift them. She had sung of stars that fought and rivers that rose, and now she saw the people forget. Deborah's final warnings. She did not shout. She did not raise her voice like a trumpet. Instead, she sat beneath her tree, as she always had, and she spoke. She spoke to those who still came, to the faithful who still listened. She spoke to the mothers who remembered the march, to the elders who had wept at the river Kishon. She spoke gently, but with urgency. "Remember the Lord," she would say, her voice steady like the wind in the branches. "Remember his wonders, his mercy, his justice. Do not forget the one who saved you." The people nodded. They respected her. They honored her. But some had already turned their ears inward. They smiled, thanked her, and walked away back to their homes, their plans, their gods. Still she spoke. "Do not let your hearts grow dull. Do not grow fat on comfort. For the Lord is not only the God of the past, he is the God of every breath, every season," she pleaded, not with fear, but with hope, that perhaps her words might awaken one soul, one family, one child. Her voice was not bitter. It was tender, but it trembled with the weight of a truth she could not force the people to carry. "Peace is a gift," she whispered to a younger woman one morning, "but it must be guarded, not with swords, but with remembrance." Some listened, some did not, And Deborah, weary but faithful, continued to pour herself out like water, one final offering to the nation she loved. The passing of the prophetess scripture does not tell of her death. There is no verse that records her final breath. No burial site known, no monument raised, no trumpet sounded when her soul returned to the God who gave it. Only the quiet, but not all holy things are marked by stone. Some fade like stars at dawn, not lost, but hidden because their light has already been given. So Deborah faded, not in sorrow, but in surrender. She had walked her path. She had spoken her words. She had obeyed the voice of the Lord. And when her time came, it was not with noise, but with stillness. Perhaps she sat beneath her tree one final time. Perhaps the breeze moved through the branches and she looked to the sky. Perhaps the same wind that once carried her song now carried her soul. And though her voice fell silent, her legacy did not. Her story lived on, not in scrolls alone, but in the hearts she shaped, in the songs sung by children who still remembered, in the quiet convictions of the few who had listened. She was a prophetess among men, a leader without a crown, a woman who had heard the Lord and answered. Like Moses, she did not see all that would come after her. But like Moses, she had obeyed, and that was enough. For the path of the faithful is not measured by how long it is walked, but by how well it is followed. And Deborah had followed. Chapter 10. When the judges slept. There is a kind of silence that follows glory, not the hush of reverence, but the weight of forgetting. Deborah's voice had once risen like the dawn, her song pouring through the valleys and hills, proclaiming the wonders of the Lord. Mothers had taught it to their children. Elders had wept when they heard it. The land itself had listened. But now, that melody was only an echo. The palm tree where she had sat still stood. Its roots held the earth, its branches reached for the sky. But no one gathered beneath its shade anymore. The dust was undisturbed. The place where wisdom once flowed had grown quiet, not because God no longer spoke, but because fewer hearts listened. A new generation had grown, one untouched by war. They had never seen iron chariots vanish in the rain. They had never climbed Mount Tabor or heard thunder as a battle cry. They did not remember Jael's tent or the trembling of Sisera's soldiers. To them, those were only stories, distant, poetic, almost unreal. And stories, when untended, begin to slip away. The memory of deliverance faded like breath on glass. The warmth of Deborah's leadership, once so near, now felt like a tale from another land. Her name was still honored, but her God, the God who stirred mountains, the God who answered from heaven, began to feel far. And so Israel drifted, not in open rebellion, but in quiet neglect. Like a ship unanchored in calm waters, the people moved gently with the current, unaware that the tide was taking them far from the shore of holiness. They did not mean to forget, but they forgot all the same. Idols at the gates. It began with small things. A carved figure hidden inside a home, not as a replacement, but as a decoration. A whispered prayer to something other than the Lord, not out of defiance, but out of fear. A festival reshaped, its songs once holy, now blended with the customs of nearby nations. No one called it rebellion. They called it blending, tolerance, wisdom. But heaven called it betrayal. Shrines rose on hilltops where altars had once burned for the Lord. Stones were stacked in circles, trees were marked and honored. Children were led up winding paths to offer incense, not to Yahweh, but to names he had forbidden. The people still spoke of God, they still mentioned his wonders, but their hearts were divided. They worshipped the God of their ancestors, and also the gods of the land, and what begins as mixture soon becomes replacement. They no longer asked, "What does the Lord desire?" They asked, "What pleases me?" The fire on the Lord's altar burned low. His covenant was cracked, chipped like pottery, handled too carelessly. The laws given at Sinai were still there, but they were no longer followed with love. And at the gates of the city, where elders once sat and remembered Deborah's words, new voices now rose, voices that praised gods with no breath, voices that mocked the restraint of covenant, voices that did not remember and did not care to. The light that once covered Israel had not vanished, but shadows had crept in, and the people did not see them. The weight of disobedience does not always come in flames. Sometimes it comes like mist, soft, slow, creeping through open doors, filling the spaces where truth once lived. And so it was in Israel. The people still lived in the same land. The same rivers flowed. The same harvests grew. But something had shifted. The peace Deborah had stewarded, a peace born from obedience, had been taken for granted. And peace, when not protected by truth, cannot hold. One day the protection began to crack. Foreign raiders came, not in armies, but in waves. They took what they pleased, and the people hid. Trade routes were no longer safe. Fields were left untended. The laughter of children was replaced by anxious silence. The cities, once secure, became places of fear, but it was not only an enemy that oppressed them. It was the weight of their own choices, because sin does not only break a covenant, it breaks the soul. Where once Israel had walked in confidence, they now walked in confusion. Where once their hearts were lit with purpose, they now wandered in dullness. Where once they had cried out to the Lord, now they cried out only in despair. Not because they trusted him to answer, but because they had nowhere else to turn. The safety they had known under Deborah was not just physical, it was spiritual. It was the safety of walking rightly with God, of knowing that his presence surrounded them like a wall of fire. But now, with every idol they had lifted, every commandment they had forgotten, that wall had lowered, and they were exposed. Their suffering was not a punishment of cruelty. It was a mercy of awakening. But mercy often looks like pain when the heart is hard, and still many did not see it. They believed they were unlucky, they did not know they were lost. Heaven still watches, but heaven had not turned away. Though the people forgot, God remembered. Though they drifted, his eyes never left them. His love had not faded with their memory. His covenant had not been dissolved by their disobedience. The promises made in fire still held their warmth. The same God who had raised Deborah still watched the land, still listened for one voice, still waited for one heart. He did not need a multitude, he needed a listener, a single soul who would pause long enough to ask, "Where is the Lord?" A single heart that would say, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Heaven waits like a sunrise, silent. Sure. Never rushed, it watches even when the world sleeps, even when the prophets grow old and the people turn to other things, even when the altars are cold and the prayers are empty. God waits, his spirit lingers, like dew upon the fields, quiet, gentle, unseen. His mercy remains, not in shouts but in whispers, not in thunder but in longing, not to destroy but to restore. And though Deborah's voice had fallen silent, though her palm tree stood alone, though her song had faded into the background of a forgetful people, God still watched, and his story was not done. He would raise another judge, another deliverer, another voice in the wilderness. Because the God of Israel does not sleep, and he never forgets his own. Chapter 11. The Women of the Wilderness. Her voice had gone quiet. Her name had faded from the lips of rulers and priests. But in the hidden corners of the land, in the hush of evening fires and the warmth of mother's arms, Deborah still lived. She lived in the stories whispered to daughters as they fell asleep, in the soft hush of remembrance passed down from generation to generation. Her name, once carried on the wind like a song, now moved softly through memory, not loud, but present. The people no longer walked in the full light she once carried. The palm tree had no prophet beneath it. The roads were no longer lined with travelers seeking her counsel, but even as Israel drifted, even as idols stood where altars had once burned, her spirit did not vanish. Among the faithful few, her story remained. There were women, unknown, unseen, who remembered. They did not stand in the square or speak in great assemblies, but they held the fire of Deborah in their hearts like a hidden ember. And in a time when much had been forgotten, these women chose to remember. They remembered her courage. They remembered her wisdom. They remembered the God she served. And in the stillness of the wilderness where no one watched, they began to echo her life, not by leading nations, but by living in obedience. The legacy of Deborah had not ended. It had gone underground, and it was still breathing, carrying the lamp forward. These women did not wear garments of distinction. They had no scrolls written in their names, no songs composed in their honor. They rose early, tended to their homes, ground grain, carried water. They were mothers, daughters, widows, midwives, but they carried something holy in a world that had forgotten the covenant. They remembered, and in remembering, they bore light. Their acts were small. A prayer whispered before bread was needed, a word of truth spoken gently to a child, a quiet refusal to bow before carved stone. These women did not speak with the voice of a prophetess, but they lived with the spirit of one. Their faith was not loud, it was steadfast. They did not wait for platforms, they lit lamps. They did not ask to be seen, they asked to be faithful. And in their hidden lives they guarded something sacred, the memory of who Israel was and who Israel belonged to. They prayed when others mocked. They served when others forgot. They believed when belief had become rare. In the early morning, they sang softly as they worked. In the quiet of the evening, they knelt beside their children and spoke of the God who had parted seas and sent rain from the heavens. And though the world around them bowed to false gods and followed false paths, these women stood, not in defiance, but in devotion. They held the line quietly, humbly. They carried the lamp forward, not with ceremony, but with courage. The forgotten servants. No one wrote their names in history's scrolls. No scribes etched their faces into stone. No storytellers sang their praises by the fire. But heaven knew them. Heaven remembered every tear they cried when no one listened, every prayer they whispered when others laughed. Every morning they rose, weary in body but steadfast in soul. These were the forgotten servants. They lived between the lines of Scripture, not in the spotlight, but in the shadow. And yet their lives were filled with light. They held their families together when the world around them unraveled. They spoke the name of Yahweh in villages where idols stood tall. They kept their faith when it was no longer fashionable. They taught their sons of Deborah's song. They taught their daughters of the God who had spoken through a woman. They guarded the stories. They tended the truth. They did not see revival. They did not lead armies. But they kept the covenant alive in their hearts, and heaven saw. Heaven saw the woman who knelt in the dust praying for her people. Heaven saw the widow who gave her last loaf to the hungry, trusting that the Lord who fed Elijah would feed her too. Heaven saw the mother who sang psalms while grinding grain, who sowed righteousness into her child's heart with every word. They were forgotten by man, but remembered by God. And that is what matters most. When quiet faith sustains a nation, the land was not healed. The idols were not torn down. The judges did not rise, but Israel did not fall completely, because there were still hearts that believed, because the story had not yet ended. In every generation there is a remnant, a thread that holds when all else frays. And in this season of silence, the thread was these women. They were not many, but they were enough. Their faith did not shake nations, but it steadied them. Their prayers did not split the sky, but they reached heaven. They were the quiet ones, and they sustained Israel, not by might, not by proclamation, but by presence, because when everything else was forgotten, they remembered. When the world chased other gods, they clung to the one true God. When others moved with the culture, they stayed rooted in the covenant. Deborah's legacy was not in her victories alone, it was in the hearts she ignited. And though her name was rarely spoken now, her fire still flickered in these quiet lives. They did not call themselves prophets, but they prophesied with how they lived. They did not call themselves warriors, but they fought. With gentleness, with loyalty, with prayer, they were not part of Israel's next great deliverance. But without them, there would be no one left to deliver. And so God watched and waited, because when He moves again, He often starts with those who are already faithful, already listening, already awake. Chapter 12. The Weeping of Israel. The land of Israel, once vibrant with harvest and humming with peace, lay bruised and broken beneath heavy silence. The sun still rose over the hills of Ephraim, but its warmth no longer stirred songs from the field. Where laughter once echoed, Fear now crept in shadows. A new enemy had come, not just one, but many, ruthless and unrelenting. They poured in like storm clouds, covering the land with the weight of their cruelty. These were not like the old oppressors whose hands were rough but predictable. No, these were fiercer. Their eyes burned with conquest. Their spears drank the blood of resistance. Their swords cut not only through men but through the heart of a nation. They stole the wheat from the threshing floors and the grapes from the vines before they ripened. They burned olive trees that had stood for generations. They swept through the land like locusts, not for a season, but year after year, without rest. Mothers hid their children in caves. Fathers prayed behind closed doors, though their lips could barely form the words. And Israel, oh Israel, groaned, but not with hope. This time their cries were thick with bitterness, not faith. They did not plead, "Deliver us." They murmured, "Why again?" The covenant once written on their hearts had faded like ink in the rain. They remembered God, but not his nearness. They spoke of him, but not to him. Still the oppression deepened. The people were not simply conquered, they were hollowed. The land beneath them still belonged to God, but their spirits seemed untethered, as if lost in exile within their own inheritance. In every village there was weeping, and in every field silence. The drought of the soul, it was not only the harvest that failed. The skies themselves turned away. No rain kissed the ground. The rivers slowed, then thinned, then disappeared into cracked beds of stone. Even the mighty Jordan shrank, as if mourning with the people. Dust rose in place of dew. Wells deepened but offered nothing. The elders said, "This is more than a drought of the land. This is the drought of our souls." There was no judge to rise and speak, no prophet to bring the word of the Lord. It was as if heaven itself had grown quiet, as if the voice that once thundered on Sinai and whispered to Deborah beneath her palm tree had turned to stillness. Israel had known silence before, but not like this. They asked each other in hushed voices, "Has God abandoned us?" But none dared answer. In the days of Deborah, the people had come beneath her tree to hear truth, to be reminded that God still saw, still guided, still led. But that tree now stood alone, branches bare, its shadow untouched. Children played elsewhere. The paths to it had overgrown, and those who remembered her voice wondered if they had only dreamed it. But God, though unseen, though unspoken, had not turned away. His silence was not forgetfulness. His stillness was not absence. Like a father watching a wayward child from afar, his eyes never left them. His heart, vast and tender, ached with every tear they cried. He waited, not for perfection, but for return. Yet still the days passed, one after another, slow as stone. The songs of deliverance faded from memory. The people worked in vain, reaped in vain, slept in fear, and woke in despair. And still, no rain. The memory returns. One night, beneath a black sky pierced by quiet stars, a circle of villagers gathered around a low fire. The flames flickered like tiny prophets, their tongues whispering against the cold. Among them sat a woman, old, wrapped in worn linen, her face lined like the folds of ancient parchment. She was not known for her strength, but for her stories. And on this night, she spoke of Deborah. The younger ones leaned in. Some had heard her name before, like a fading tale passed down at dusk. But tonight it returned with weight. The woman's voice was soft but steady, like a stream cutting through desert rock. She sat beneath the palm of Lapidoth, the old woman began, her eyes reflecting the fire. And the people came to her because God had given her wisdom, not the kind of wisdom that fills scrolls, but the kind that awakens hearts. She told of the days when Deborah called Barak to rise, when 10,000 followed the voice of the Lord into battle, when even the stars seemed to fight on Israel's side, when victory came not from might but from obedience. When Sisera, the enemy of God's people, fell not by sword but by the hand of a woman, a tent peg driven through the darkness of fear. The child nearest the fire gasped. "Is it true?" he whispered. The woman nodded slowly. "It is." Deborah sang a song that day, a song the earth remembers even if we forget, a song that told of God's faithfulness. Even now, if you listen closely, the stones still echo it. The others fell quiet. The crackling of the fire became holy, and in the silence that followed, something stirred, a memory, a flicker of something long buried beneath the rubble of pain. It was not just the story of Deborah they heard, it was the voice of God through her. The memory was not merely of past glory, but of his enduring mercy. Some wept, not with sorrow, but with longing, as if remembering a father they had not spoken to in years. The old woman smiled, though her eyes were wet. If he delivered us, then he can deliver us now, but we must return, not to a place but to him. The fire crackled louder, the stars burned brighter, and somewhere deep in the hearts of those gathered, repentance began. A cry that reaches heaven, it began not with a shout, but a whisper. One man, alone in the early morning, fell to his knees. The earth was still dry, his hands were still calloused from toil, but something inside him broke, not from despair, but from surrender. And he wept. "Lord," he said, his voice barely rising above the wind, "we have strayed far, but we are yours." He did not try to impress heaven. He did not wrap his words in ceremony. He simply opened his heart, raw and trembling, and heaven listened. Others began to follow. In homes, in fields, in caves, they cried, not rehearsed prayers, not polished words, but groans, tears, and sighs too deep for language. The cry of a people who no longer demanded but yielded, who no longer pointed fingers but opened hands. And heaven answered, not with fire, not with thunder, but with mercy. A stillness came, not the silence of distance, but the stillness of presence. The kind that wraps around you like a blanket in winter. The kind that says, "I am here." Rain did not fall that day. Enemies did not flee. But something greater happened. God turned his face towards them again. The drought was not over, but it had been pierced. A cloud no larger than a man's hand rose on the horizon of hope. Somewhere in the distance, under the sleeping sky, a mother sang an old song, the song of Deborah. Her voice was quiet, but her faith was loud. And so the weeping of Israel, once bitter, became sacred. It was not the end of their suffering, but it was the beginning of their return, and God, ever faithful, waited, not with wrath, but with open arms. Chapter 13. The next judge rises. There are moments in Israel's story when deliverance does not thunder from the heavens, but tiptoes softly into the lives of the least expected. This is how Gideon's calling begins, not in might or splendor, but in hiding. The land still bears the bruises of oppression. Though the memory of Deborah brings flickers of courage, the weight of fear has settled once more across the people. The Midianites now plague them, a relentless nomadic force, stripping the land bare like scavengers in a field of plenty. Their cruelty is methodical. At every harvest they descend with camels and swords, leaving famine behind. The people dig shelters in hillsides and dens in the rocks. They whisper instead of sing, and Gideon, son of Joash, hides. He is not a warrior. He is not a prophet. He is not a man of renown. He is a young man from the weakest clan of Manasseh, threshing wheat in a winepress, crouched in a hollowed-out pit, trying to keep food from being stolen. His hands are dusted with grain, but his heart is heavy with doubt. Yet it is there, in the quiet of concealment, that God speaks. The angel of the Lord appears, not with a shout, but a greeting. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. The words fall strangely on Gideon's ears. Mighty warrior? He looks around, unsure the greeting is meant for him. But the angel's gaze does not waver. Gideon's voice trembles. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened? It is not defiance, but the ache of a wounded heart. Yet God is not angered. Instead, he calls, "Go in the strength you have. I am sending you." Gideon's eyes widen. His hands are still rough with fear. His family insignificant. His spirit unsure. But God's choice is not bound by strength. It is bound by willingness. Even in the shadows, the Lord sees the heart that is ready, however trembling, to obey. A broken altar, a new covenant. That night, beneath the same stars that once watched over Deborah's palm tree, Gideon receives his first task. It is not battle, it is obedience. The Lord speaks again. Tear down your father's altar to Baal. In its place, he commands a new altar, one dedicated to him, the true and living God. Gideon's breath catches. The altar has stood for years. It is the centerpiece of his town's worship, though its fire serves no life. To tear it down is to declare war not only against idols but against fear itself. And yet Gideon obeys. He takes 10 servants, and under the cover of night, he moves. His hands shake, his steps are careful, but he does not turn back. With axe and rope, he pulls the altar apart. The wooden pole of Asherah falls. Stones crash like thunder in the night. Then there, in the same place, he builds anew, a simple altar, a quiet declaration. The next morning, the town awakens to find their idol gone. Anger rises. The people cry out for justice, not for truth, but for tradition. They demand Gideon's life, but Joash, his father, surprises them all. If Baal is a god, let him contend for himself. And with those words, Gideon's obedience becomes a spark. Something shifts in Israel, not loudly, not widely, but deeply. The true altar stands, and for the first time in years, sacrifice rises to the one who listens. A new covenant begins, not written on scrolls, but etched in the courage of a trembling man. Victory by the hand of the few news spreads. Gideon, once hidden, now called Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend becomes a name whispered with hope. The Spirit of the Lord clothes him like a mantle. Trumpets are blown. Men gather. An army rises. But God is not finished reshaping the heart of the nation. He looks at the thousands who have come and says, "Too many." Not for battle, but for glory. If Israel wins with such strength, they will boast in themselves, and so begins the winnowing. First, all who are afraid are allowed to return home. 22,000 leave. Still too many, says the Lord. Then, at the water's edge, he gives a sign. Watch how they drink, he says. Those who kneel and drink with care are sent away. Those who cup the water and stay alert. Only 300 are chosen. 300 men. Against an army too vast to count, but God is not concerned with numbers. He is concerned with trust. In the darkness of night, he speaks again to Gideon. If you are afraid, go down to the camp and listen. Gideon obeys. He creeps near and hears an enemy soldier speak of a dream, a loaf of barley tumbling into their camp, flattening a tent. It can be nothing but the sword of Gideon, says the other. Gideon returns, knees trembling, but faith awakened. He arms his men not with swords, but with trumpets, torches, and clay jars. At his signal, they surround the enemy and shout, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" The jars break, the light blazes, the trumpets sound, and chaos erupts in the Midianite camp. They turn on each other in confusion. Fear spreads like wildfire. The enemy flees not from might, but from the presence of God. The victory belongs to the Lord. The story echoes Deborah's few against many, faith against fear, God glorified through the hands of the willing. Israel once again is delivered, not by armies but by obedience. The pattern repeats. Peace returns to the land. Gideon is honored. The people offer him kingship, but he refuses. The Lord will rule over you, he says, with clarity and conviction. Yet the peace is fragile. Gideon lives long and leads well. But when he dies, the people forget. Again, the altar he built remains, but their hearts wander. They chase idols once more. They abandon the one who never abandoned them. The pattern repeats. Obedience and forgetting, deliverance and drifting. Still, Gideon's rise remains a testimony that God's faithfulness is not dependent on human perfection. He chooses the least to show his strength. He speaks in shadows to bring light. He works through weakness to reveal glory. The echoes of Deborah's story do not end with her. They ripple through time, through Gideon, through each judge, through every soul, willing to say, "Here I am." And though Israel may forget, God does not. He watches. He waits. He calls again. For the story of Israel is not just a history. It is a heartbeat, a rhythm of mercy, a song of return, a promise that even when the people weep or wander, their God is near. And so the chapter closes not with an end, but with an invitation to remember, to return, to trust the God who calls. The hiding strengthens the trembling and builds altars in the ruins. Chapter 14. The Song Remembered. The wind moved gently through the hills of Israel, as if it remembered something long sung, something sacred. There, on the edge of a small village nestled between quiet olive groves, a group of children played. Beneath the open sky, their laughter rose like birds in flight, and their voices, soft and untrained, carried a melody older than their years. It was not a new song. It had no polished chorus or refined meter. It was the song of Deborah, not as it had once been thundered on the battlefield, but now whispered gently, like a prayer before sleep. They did not know every word, but they knew its soul, and that was enough. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, utter a song. One of the older girls led the chant, her hands swaying like reeds in the wind. The younger ones followed, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of the past. What had once been a call to arms had become, in their mouths, a lullaby of remembrance. They were not warriors, they were not judges, but they carried the legacy. Their parents watched from afar, quietly, thoughtfully. Many had grown up hearing that same song from the lips of elders now long gone. Some remembered their own mothers humming its verses while grinding grain or drawing water. It was more than a melody. It was a heartbeat, a lifeline, a reminder that once, when the night was darkest, God had raised a woman from the shadows and placed His word in her mouth. And now, long after the swords had been laid down, long after Deborah had passed into the arms of eternity, her voice lived on and through monuments or scrolls, but in the wind, in the hearts of children, in the hope that even the smallest voice can sing God's truth. When stories keep the spirit, a lifetime moves like a river, always forward, never stopping. And with time, many things are lost. Kings and temples, armies and cities, stones crumble, thrones are forgotten, but stories live. The people of Israel knew this well, for even in the years when the altar of the Lord was quiet and the land was weary with wandering, the stories remained. In each village, someone remembered. In each home, someone told. And so it was with Deborah. Long after her feet had ceased to walk the paths of Ephraim, her story traveled. Mothers told it to daughters while weaving linen. Fathers shared it by firelight when the fields had been worked and the sun had set, and the children, wide-eyed and wonder-filled, listened. She was not just a prophetess. She was a testimony, a living breath of courage for those who feared, a steady voice for those who doubted. Her story became the bones of faith, unshakable. Even when flesh grew weak, even when judges failed and priests grew cold, Deborah's tale remained warm. It carried the lessons of trust, the power of obedience, the mystery of divine strength working through human weakness. It reminded the listener that God does not forget His people, and He does not only speak through the mighty. Sometimes He speaks through a mother under a tree, and so, generation after generation, the song was sung. Not always in full, not always perfectly, but always with reverence. Like passing down a torch in the night, the story kept the spirit alive. Israel's hope did not rest on institutions, it rested on remembrance. And Deborah's voice, gentle and enduring, was part of that holy memory. A voice for the forgotten, the song of Deborah was more than a tale of victory. It was a voice for the forgotten. In a world that often looked past the lowly, the quiet, the unseen, Deborah's story stood as a light in the wilderness. She had not come from a throne room. She did not ride into battle with golden armor or royal decree. She had sat beneath a tree, a woman of wisdom, a servant of God, chosen not for her status, but for her surrender. And so her story spoke not only to women, but to all who felt unseen. The poor, the weary, the outcast, the child who wondered if God noticed them, the elder who felt their time had passed. Deborah's voice reached them all. She reminded Israel that God does not see as man sees. He looks to the heart. He hears the softest cry. He honors the hidden faithfulness of those who love him in secret, and her life proclaimed a truth that echoed through the hills. No heart is too quiet to be chosen. For every girl who doubted her worth, Deborah was a mirror. For every servant who labored without praise, she was a friend. For every soul who prayed in silence, she was a sister. Through her, the forgotten were remembered, and as her story passed from lips to hearts, it lifted the heads of the lowly. It taught them that their God is a God who sees, who speaks, and who calls, even in the stillness. The legacy of light legacies are often measured in towers and titles, in riches and renown. But the legacy of Deborah is different. It is not carved into marble or etched in gold. It is not guarded behind palace walls. It lives in songs. It lives in footsteps. It lives in the quiet courage of those who dare to trust God, even when the world forgets them. Her voice, once raised in a hymn of triumph, became part of the everlasting story. Not because of volume, but because of faith. Not because of fame, but because of obedience. She left behind no crown, but she crowned generations with hope. She left behind no laws, but she upheld the law of love. She left behind no city, but she built something greater, a memory that awakens faith, and so her legacy is light. Light that flickers in the eyes of a child singing her song, light that shines in the heart of a woman who believes again, light that glows in the quiet soul who says yes to God, even when the way is unclear. Her story is a thread in God's eternal tapestry, not the largest thread, not the brightest, but woven with grace and essential. The Lord who called Deborah once to rise and sing still calls today, and her melody, now a lullaby, now a whisper, still dances on the wind. May those who hear it remember. May those who remember rise, may those who rise trust, and may the song never fade. Chapter 15. Prophetess in the Scrolls. In the sacred scrolls of old, where the names of Israel's deliverers are remembered, Deborah's name is carved in holy ink, steady, unshaken, sure. The book of Judges, nestled in the tapestry of Scripture, records the rise and fall of a restless people, their wandering hearts, their desperate cries, and the faithful hand of God raising up one judge after another to deliver them. There, between the stories of bloodshed and peace, idolatry and return, Deborah's story gently unfolds. Her name appears only briefly, her story contained within 2 chapters. But what she leaves behind is not measured by length. It is measured by faith. She is not introduced with fanfare. There are no trumpet blasts, no royal declarations. Simply, she is named Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth. She judged Israel under the palm tree between Ramah and Bethel. The people came to her, not because she demanded power, but because they recognized the wisdom of God in her words. Among judges known for their strength, Deborah is known for her clarity. Among leaders known for warfare, she is remembered. For discernment, she does not wield a sword, yet she calls armies to rise. She does not lead by title, but by trust. And in the scroll, she is not separated because she is a woman, nor elevated because of it. She is remembered because she obeyed. Her story rests among men like Ehud and Gideon, Samson and Jephthah. But Deborah's presence does not compete. It completes. Her obedience shines not as an exception, but as a revelation that God's call is not confined to the strong or the expected. It reaches anyone who will listen. And in the quiet of Scripture, among the echoes of judges past, Deborah still speaks why her story endures. The scrolls turn. Centuries pass. Generations rise and fall. Yet the story of Deborah endures. Why? Not because she conquered with might. Not because she wore a crown or built a kingdom. Her legacy does not cling to monuments or battles. It rests in something quieter and far more lasting: faith. Deborah believed when others hesitated. She spoke when others were silent. She stood when others knelt in fear. She trusted not in chariots or men, but in the voice of the Lord. And that trust became her strength. Her story is not loud, but it is unshakable. In every generation, someone reads her name for the first time and wonders how such a brief story can leave such a deep impression. They see her sitting beneath the tree, eyes steady, heart open to heaven. They hear her speak with clarity to Barak. They watch her rise to battle not with sword, but with song, and they are stirred. For Deborah shows that true strength does not always roar. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it whispers truth when the world has forgotten it. Her weapon was not sharpened steel, but sharpened faith. Her armor was not iron, but trust. And through her, God reminded his people, then and now, that victory belongs to him alone. Even when the world forgets, faith remembers. Even when voices fade, obedience echoes. And so her story endures, not as legend, but as truth, a mirror for the listeners. Every story in Scripture is a reflection, a mirror in which we see not only the past, but ourselves. Deborah's story, though ancient, remains alive, and to hear it is to look inward. She did not ask to be chosen. She did not chase power or praise. She simply listened with a heart soft toward God and a spirit willing to act. And when the time came, she rose. Are we willing to do the same? Her life is not just a lesson, it is an invitation. Will we be faithful in the quiet places, sitting under the trees of our lives, attentive to God's voice? Will we speak truth with tenderness, even when others turn away? Will we step forward when called, even if fear shadows our path? Deborah's story becomes a mirror, not to shame us, but to stir us, not to burden us, but to awaken us, because in her story we see the beauty of a life fully offered to God, not perfect, but surrendered, not famous, but faithful, and that faithfulness becomes a path. a light for those who doubt their value, a guide for those who feel too small to be used, a hope for those waiting to hear from heaven. Her voice says, "You do not need to be mighty to be chosen. You need only to listen. You need only to say yes." The end that becomes beginning. The scrolls continue. Deborah's name fades from the written line, passed by the ink of new judges and unfolding stories. Israel moves on, sometimes forward, sometimes back, but her story does not end. It becomes seed. Each listener who reads her tale carries something away, a spark, a song, a stirring of trust. Each life touched by her faith becomes another beginning. She is not just a figure in history. She is part of the foundation of faith, a stone laid in the path that leads through Scripture to the one who fulfills all promises. And so, while the scroll turns to other names, her echo remains. It sings in the lullabies of children. It whispers in the courage of the unseen. It breathes in the obedience of the willing. Her story ends on the page, but not in the heart. God's tapestry is woven not only with prophets and kings, but with women under trees, with songs sung in the face of fear, with faith that trusts the unseen. Deborah's thread runs through them all. And for every soul who hears her name, for every voice who lifts her song, for every heart who listens and says yes, her ending becomes their beginning. Because the story of Deborah was never about Deborah alone. It was about the God who speaks and the people who listen, and that story will never end. Chapter 16. A Kingdom in Waiting. Before Saul, before David, before the trumpet of coronations echoed through Israel's hills, there was Deborah. In the hush that preceded monarchy, there was no palace, no throne carved of cedar, no velvet drapery, brushing the tent's edge. Israel was a people scattered across tribes, connected not by crown, but by covenant. And in that sacred stillness God raised a judge, a prophetess who walked not among scrolls and gold, but among olive trees and open fields. Deborah sat beneath the palm that bore her name. It was not a throne, but it was holy. There, in the open air, the people came, not to bow, but to ask. Not to flatter, but to seek wisdom. They brought their disputes, their doubts, their fears. And Deborah, with eyes steady and voice sure, listened. She judged, she prayed, she answered, not from power, but from presence. There was no anointing oil upon her head, no crown to glitter under the sun, and yet she led armies. She summoned Barak. She sang the song of deliverance, and all of it, every moment, flowed from her intimacy with the Lord. Her authority did not rise from bloodline or battle conquest, but from quiet communion with the voice of God. Israel had no king, yet lacked nothing, for the Lord himself reigned through the hands of his servant, through the heart of his prophet. Deborah was the proof that God's reign is not limited by human rituals, that holiness can lead, that righteousness can rule. The days after her victory were not marked by banners or feasts. They were marked by peace. For 40 years the land rested, fields grew full, and children laughed in the streets. The swords of Sisera rusted into memory, and the people remembered what it was like to be governed by someone who knelt before the Lord more than they stood before men. It was a kingdom without a king, and it was beautiful in God's eyes. God rules. Without a throne, Deborah's story is not merely a chapter in Israel's history, it is a window into God's heart. For in her we see that God's rule does not need regalia. He does not search for splendor, he searches for surrender. He chose a woman in the hill country of Ephraim, not for her status, not for her stature, but for her spirit. She listened when others doubted. She believed when others feared. She obeyed when others hesitated. And through her, the Lord reminded his people that he does not need earthly seats to reign from heavenly heights. God does not wait for earthly kingdoms to rise. He builds his kingdom in the unseen places through hearts that are wholly his. Deborah was his vessel, and through her justice was done, mercy was shown, and peace was restored. She never wore a robe of kingship. Her hands bore no scepter, but her voice carried the word of the Lord, and that word held more power than any royal decree. The heavens themselves honored her obedience. The stars fought for her. The river Kishon swept away the enemy because she walked in step with her Maker. And this was not just about one woman, it was a declaration that in every age God will reign through those who are willing, not through the mighty, but through the meek. Not through titles, but through trust. Israel in Deborah's day had no monarch, but they had something better. They had the presence of God moving among them, leading them, not through institutions, but through intimacy, not with armor, but with anointing. In Deborah's time, there were no golden halls, but there was glory, and that glory rested on faithfulness. It rested on a palm tree, on a prophetess, and on the quiet obedience that turns the world. The longing for a king, but time has a way of softening memories, of dimming the brilliance of what once was holy. And slowly a restlessness stirred among the people. The elders gathered at the gates and whispered. The travelers returned from foreign lands with stories. The children grew into men and women, and they looked around and wanted more. Not more of God, but more of man. They saw the nations around them, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and envied their kings, the robes, the crowns, the banners, the armies that moved in unison beneath one figurehead. They began to dream, not of righteousness, but of recognition, not of justice, but of grandeur. They remembered Deborah's reign, but faintly. They remembered the peace, but not the prayer. They remembered the victories, but forgot the voice that guided them. And so their hearts turned. We want a king, they would say, like the other nations, someone who will lead us, someone we can see. But in their cry was a forgetting of the one who had parted seas, who had spoken from the mountain, who had thundered through Deborah's words and brought peace without a crown. This longing was not born of need, it was born of pride, the desire to be seen, to be honored, to be feared by others. They wanted structure over surrender, power over presence. And in heaven the Lord heard. He who had walked with them, carried them, fought for them, now heard his people asking for a replacement. They were choosing image over intimacy, earthly rule over divine relationship. And though the Lord would one day grant their request, he marked it with sorrow. For in their desire for a king, they had forgotten what it meant to be led by God alone. Deborah's memory faded from their minds, but not from God's. Her reign had been gentle, spirit-led, and sacred. It had needed no palace, no parade, just a palm tree, a listening heart, and the voice of the Almighty. She was a judge, a prophet, a mother in Israel, and her life stood as a quiet, holy contrast to the kings they now craved, when obedience is greater than gold. In the long sweep of Israel's history, thrones would rise and fall. Crowns would be placed on many brows, some noble, some foolish. Kingdoms would prosper, then fracture. But the lesson of Deborah would remain like a whisper through the corridors of time, that God values obedience more than gold, that faithfulness is finer than any jewel, that the quiet yes of a servant's heart is weightier in heaven than the roars of 1,000 armies. Deborah's legacy was not one of wealth or conquest. It was one of righteousness. She did not leave behind monuments or treasures, but she left behind a story that teaches even the smallest, most unseen act of obedience can change a nation. And long after kings would forget the Lord, long after idols would be carved and altars desecrated, Deborah's life would remain as a soft rebuke, a reminder that Israel's finest days were not when gold adorned temples, but when God adorned hearts. In every age, the Lord continues to seek those like her. Not those who reach for greatness, but those who bow in reverence. Not those who speak loudly, but those who listen closely. Not those who crave rule, but those who crave righteousness. Deborah's story was not just for her time, it is for ours. In her, we see what God cherishes most, a heart fully yielded, a spirit tuned to his whispers, a life lived in holy trust. And so, as the last light of her chapter fades into the horizon of Israel's unfolding tale, her example stands still, unmoved by the tides of kings and crowns, steady, sacred, a kingdom in waiting, a people led by presence, a nation once ruled by the purity of obedience and the voice of a prophet beneath a tree. May we remember her, may we follow her example, and may we always choose the path where God reigns, crowned not with gold, but with grace. Chapter 17. The Woman, the Warrior, the Witness. The morning light filtered gently through the leaves of the palm tree, casting a dappled dance of shadow and sun across the earth below. There, in that quiet space between heaven and earth, Deborah sat, not as queen nor as soldier, but simply as one who belonged to God. The people who came to her called her many things: prophetess, judge, mother in Israel. Some knew her as a wife, others a leader of armies. Her names were many, her titles varied, but none could fully hold the breadth of who she was. For Deborah was not formed by what people called her. She was formed by the one who called her. She bore no need for grandeur. She never grasped for greatness. Her greatness came from stillness, from surrender, from being wholly available to the purpose of the Lord. There were other judges in Israel's story, men who had strength, who wielded weapons, who rallied tribes, but Deborah stood apart, not for lack of might, but for the depth of her trust, not for the loudness of her command, but for the clarity of her calling. To some, she was a mystery, a woman who led without fear, a wife who also sat in judgment, a voice that carried the word of God through the land. She confounded the lines that others tried to draw. between public and private, between strength and softness, between prophet and warrior. But to heaven she was simple, a servant, a vessel, a flame lit by obedience. Her story was never about becoming someone great. It was about becoming exactly who God needed where He needed her. In the days before kings, when Israel wandered and struggled, God did not send royalty. He sent Deborah. Not because she fit the mold of leadership, but because she fit the heart of His mission. She was willing, and that was enough. There is something sacred about a life that resists labels, about a soul that is content to be known not by the world's applause, but by the whisper of heaven. Deborah wore many roles, but none of them owned her. She belonged to God alone, and in that belonging, she became more than any single title could ever express. She became a story that still breathes, a light that still glows, a life that reminds us that our purpose is not found in roles or ranks, but in faithfulness. She was the woman, she was the warrior, she was the witness, and through it all, she was His. The strength to listen. If Deborah had a weapon, it was not the sword, it was not the bow, it was not the chariot or the spear. Her weapon was her ear. In a world filled with noise, Deborah could hear God. It was a strength, not loud, but lasting, not showy, but sacred. While others leaned on numbers and armies, Deborah leaned on presence. While others strategized, she listened. And it was in the listening that history began to shift. Under the swaying branches of her palm tree, she waited, not for the cries of men, but for the quiet of God. She did not rush to speak. She did not hurry to act. She waited for the voice that came not in thunder but in stillness, and when that voice came, she knew it. The same voice that had spoken to Abraham, the same voice that called Moses from a bush of fire, the same voice that would one day be heard in Galilee on hillsides and waters. Deborah knew that voice, and it was enough. In her listening, she received the courage to command. In her stillness, she gained the wisdom to lead. For leadership in God's kingdom does not begin with speaking, it begins with hearing. Barak came to her not because she had authority in title, but because she had authority in spirit. She heard God. And when she said, "The Lord has gone out before you," her words were not strategy, they were revelation. The strength to listen is not always celebrated. It does not fill courts or echo through marketplaces, but it moves mountains, it defeats enemies, it opens paths where none were seen before. Deborah's listening shaped a nation. Her quiet courage brought deliverance, because when she heard the Lord speak, she believed Him. There were no signs, no miracles to persuade her. Only the voice. And that was all she needed. In the hush of that sacred communion, we are reminded, strength does not always shout. Sometimes it simply listens. And in that listening, it learns to lead. When courage comes softly, courage does not always come with a roar. It does not always stand tall on battlefields or raise banners in the wind. Sometimes courage comes softly, like oil in a lamp, keeping the flame alive when all else fades. Deborah's courage was like that. Gentle, steady, sacred. She did not fight with her hands, but with her heart. She did not storm gates, but she opened them, through prayer, through prophecy, through unwavering trust in God's command. She did not raise her voice to gather crowds. She raised her voice to declare what was holy. She did not seek war, but when war came, she stood without fear. Her courage was not like fire, wild and consuming. It was like oil, poured carefully, anointed with purpose, lasting long after the battle was done. Barak would not go without her. Not because she was stronger in body, but because she was stronger in faith. Her presence was a signal. God is with us. And with that assurance, men found their strength. She went to the battlefield, not as a general, but as a flame-bearer. She carried the light of God's word into the shadows of fear, and the enemy could not stand against that light. Even when she sang that ancient song of triumph after Sisera fell, it was not boastful. It was a hymn of remembrance, a song that pointed not to her own hand, but to the hand of the Lord. Deborah's courage did not make her famous, it made her faithful. And faithfulness is a courage that outlasts empires. We often look for heroes who dazzle, who dominate, who break through with noise, but heaven looks for those whose courage comes softly, who remain when others flee, who listen when others speak, who trust when others doubt. Deborah was that kind of hero. Her story reminds us that true strength is not always in the shout, but in the whisper that refuses to go out, a witness through the ages. Long after her footsteps faded from the dust of Canaan, Deborah's witness remains, not as a statue, not as a monument, but as a living flame, a light passed from heart to heart, generation to generation. Even now, as her story is told again, Deborah bears witness, not to her own name, not to her own victory, but to the one who called her, every moment of her. Life was a testimony, not to self, but to surrender, not to human strength, but to divine leading, not to what a woman could do, but to what God could do through anyone fully yielded. She was never the center of her own story. The center was always God. And that is why her story still breathes. That is why it matters still. When the world forgets what obedience looks like, Deborah reminds us. When the world forgets that strength can wear gentleness, Deborah teaches us again. When we forget that God chooses the quiet, the unseen, the available, Deborah's story calls us back. A palm tree, a prophetess, a war won not by might, but by faith. These are not echoes of a forgotten past. They are seeds planted deep in the soil of Scripture, bearing fruit even now. She bore witness with her words, with her judgments, with her song, but most of all, with her trust. And so her voice continues, not through the wind, but through the Spirit, whispering through the pages of the Bible, calling to those who still long to listen, still long to follow, still long to say, "Here I am, Lord, use me." Deborah's story is not about fame. It is not about firsts. It is about faith. Faith that leaves a legacy. Faith that points always upward to the one who reigns without needing a throne, who calls without needing applause, who leads without ever leaving. She was the woman. She was the warrior. She was the witness, and her witness still stands. Softly, eternally. Amen. Chapter 18. The Sleep of the Faithful. The battle was over. The cries had long since faded into the past. The dust of war had settled, and the fields that once echoed with the clash of chariots now whispered only with the breeze. And Deborah, she had returned to the stillness. Not the stillness of fear or of loss, but of peace. Deep, holy peace. There was no parade, no crown placed upon her head, no monument of stone erected in her honor. Instead, there was night, a night that descended softly like a shawl over weary shoulders. A night filled not with shadows, but with stars. Deborah had finished her race. The people remembered her song, a song sung on the day of victory when Sisera had fallen and peace had returned to the land. They remembered how her voice lifted not to boast, but to bless, how she praised the God of Israel with every line. And then, when the song ended, she had not sought applause. She had returned quietly to the palm tree where it all began, and there she remained, judging Israel, praying, watching, listening. Until one day even that grew still. She did not pass away in fear. She did not fade in bitterness. Her life did not end with unrest. It ended in peace, because she had poured it all out, every gift, every word, every breath, for the sake of the one who called her. The night after the battle was not a night of sorrow. It was a night of sacred rest. The land had peace for 40 years. And in that time, Deborah walked not with triumph in her eyes, but with a quiet joy. She had obeyed, she had loved, she had led. And now her body grew tired, but her soul was full. She had seen what many could only imagine. She had heard the voice of the Lord and answered. She had stood when others hesitated and spoken when silence was easier. And now she rested. In the quiet of that night, she lay her head down, not on a bed of gold, but on the faithfulness of God. Her work was done, her soul was safe, and heaven watched. The echo in the silence. There are voices that shout and then fade, but there are others, gentler ones, that remain long after they have grown silent. Deborah's voice no longer stirred the crowds beneath the palm tree. She no longer called warriors to the field or judged disputes among the tribes. Her tent was empty now. Her place beneath the tree, quiet, and yet something remained, an echo. Not the kind that bounces loudly from stone to stone, but the kind that lives in memory, the kind that moves quietly through Scripture, resting gently in the hearts of those who read her story by candlelight or whisper her name in prayer. Her silence was not empty. It was full of completed purpose, full of promises kept, full of a life well lived. Deborah's silence speaks louder now than many voices. It says, you can trust him. It says, you can lead without pride. It says, you can walk in the quiet power of obedience. The echo of her life is woven into the words of the judges, into the songs of faith, into the legacy of every servant who ever dared to say yes to the Lord. In the stillness of the Scriptures, her name is spoken gently, never with fanfare, but always with honor. She is not remembered for what the world remembers, not for wealth or fame or the building of kingdoms. She is remembered for her listening, for her love, for her loyalty to God. And that kind of legacy does not fade, even now as her story is told again. As a voice reads it aloud to those falling asleep. Under soft lamplight, the echo continues. The echo that says, God sees, God calls, God reigns. And in that silence, in that blessed stillness, her voice still walks with us. A prayer over generations. Let her story be a prayer, not just a memory, not just a tale of long ago, but a living, breathing prayer that reaches across time. From her days beneath the palm to the hearts of listeners tonight. A prayer for courage. The kind that does not demand attention, but walks faithfully in the light that God provides. The kind that says yes, even when the path is steep. A prayer for wisdom. The wisdom to hear what is holy, to speak only when God speaks, to move not in the rhythm of the world, but in the rhythm of the Spirit. A prayer for listening hearts. Hearts that are not drawn to noise or status, but to the quiet place where God whispers. Hearts that remember Deborah's strength. Not in sword, but in surrender. Not in might, but in mercy. Let this story be a lullaby to the soul that still believes. A comfort to the weary. A reminder to the faithful. Let it be a light in the dark and a hand upon the shoulder, saying softly, you are not alone. You walk a path already walked by the ones who trusted before you. Deborah's prayer lives on, not in her lips now, but in ours. When we speak with compassion, when we lead with humility, when we rest in the will of God, we carry her prayer forward. And when our children ask who she was, we can answer with quiet joy. She was the one who said yes to God. And because of her, peace came. Because of her, others stood. Because of her, we believe. This is the kind of prayer that does not end. It flows through generations as gentle as rain on thirsty soil. And as it falls upon each new heart, something sacred grows. So tonight, as we rest, let us hold her story as prayer. Not words on a page, not a chapter closed, but a whisper from one faithful soul to another until the dawn breaks. And now the light grows faint. The stars take their place in the quiet sky. The winds soften. The earth exhales. The listener lies still now, the heart gently beating beneath the covers. The eyelids grow heavy, and the voice telling Deborah's story grows soft. Sleep comes, not the kind of sleep that forgets, but the kind that remembers, the kind that rests in peace, because it knows that the God who watched over Deborah still watches over us. She once walked the earth, barefoot on holy ground, her garments dusted by the trail of justice and prayer. And now she sleeps. But her rest is not the end. It is the pause before the dawn, because one day all who sleep in faith shall rise. As Deborah did, in the presence of the Lord, we believe in that dawn. We wait for it. And until it comes, we tell the stories of those who walked before us. We speak their names not as ghosts, but as lights, as reminders that God does not forget, that faith does not fade, that heaven keeps count. Deborah the prophetess, Deborah the judge, Deborah the woman of God. She has not vanished, she has simply gone ahead. And in the morning, when the trumpet sounds and the heavens open, she will rise again, not to battle, but to glory. Not to judge, but to rejoice. Not to lead, but to worship. So tonight, let your soul rest. Let the light of her life wrap around you like a warm shawl. Let the stillness be holy. Let the silence speak. And as the last words are spoken, as the breath deepens, as the world grows quiet, know this: the sleep of the faithful is never in vain, and morning always comes.